3, 2, 1. Fin des scènes.
Cruise missiles launched from a French warship last night. France said 12 were fired and there was no indication they'd been intercepted. With afterburners glowing and loaded with Storm Shadow cruise missiles, 4 RAF Tornadoes took to the skies as Britain's contribution to the raids. Their target, a bunker and command post near the city of Homs, believed to be the location of stockpiled chemical weapons. In the Syrian capital Damascus, the target was a research laboratory. The skies above the city lit up with incoming missiles and the interceptor rockets fired in retaliation. Night vision footage appears to show at least one being hit. Syria claims 13 were destroyed before reaching their targets.
Last night's strikes by the US, UK and France were significantly larger than the US action a year ago and specifically designed to have a greater impact on the regime's capability and willingness to use chemical weapons. And this collective action sends a clear message that the international community will not stand by and tolerate the use of chemical weapons.
The raids targeted locations on the outskirts of the Syrian capital Damascus and Homs. In Washington, President Trump sent this message to Syria's allies, Iran and Russia.
What kind of a nation wants to be associated with the mass murder of innocent men, women, and children? The nations of the world can be judged by the friends they keep. No nation can succeed in the long run by promoting rogue states, brutal tyrants, and murderous dictators.
Russia said such actions would not be without consequences. In a briefing, the Russian military said 103 missiles have been launched, 71 had been shot down. A spokesman said his country was now considering supplying Syria and other countries with the S-300 defensive missile system. On what it called a morning of victory, the Syrian presidency released these pictures of Bashar al-Assad. He said the overnight raids only increased his resolve to fight and crush terrorism in every inch of his country. Syrian television showed these pictures of what was said to be damage caused by one of the missile strikes against Homs. 3 civilians were said to have been injured. On the streets of Damascus, there was defiance this morning. This man said the enemy missiles were destroyed in the Syrian skies and his country had not been affected in any way. The US, Britain and France said the aim of the strike was to destroy Syria's chemical weapons, not to change its regime. Andy Moore, BBC News.
Well, we've seen a lot of reaction from around the world, but what is the reaction in Damascus? As I said, just not too far away at all from here. I'll bring in Martin Patience, our Middle East correspondent here in Beirut. And Martin, I mean, we saw in Andy's report there, President Assad, his briefcase in hand, his suit on, looking calm and walking slowly and carefully into the presidential palace. I mean, trying to give an image of business as usual?
I think very much so. I think earlier in the week he perhaps would have been very worried when if the military action had matched the rhetoric, it could have potentially been very serious indeed. What we appear to have seen is surgical, precise strikes, but he has been speaking, and he says that these airstrikes increase his resolve to continue fighting and crushing terrorism in every inch of the nation. So he says the fight goes on. Yes, he's been punished for using chemical weapons, but that doesn't mean he can't use airstrikes as well as soldiers on the ground.
Interesting that although there are varying accounts as to how many missiles were shot out of the air, the Syrians say they might have got quite a few of them, the Russians say they got 70 out of 110 or whatever it is. Varying accounts on that, not really varying accounts on the civilian damage.
No, that's interesting. Infrastructure, varying accounts of the damage done. In terms of civilian casualties, well, the only report we've had is that 3 civilians were injured, and that was in a facility close to Homs. But other than that, in the capital, No reports whatsoever of
That's
any
what the
casualties.
Syrians are saying, and fairly similar figures from the US and the British as well. So, you know, where does this go now as far as Damascus is concerned?
Well, I think we just heard where it goes there. The fight will continue. And what's been interesting, all the comments we've heard from world leaders, they've been saying this is not about Syria, it's not about regime change, it's not about changing the course of the war, it's about drawing the red line on chemical weapons. So implicitly, they're saying to President Assad, don't use chemical weapons, but the war can go on, can continue as you like it. You have a free hand in regard to that.
Question about Lebanon and by implication the wider region. You live here. You were telling me earlier in the week that one of your neighbours was expressing a bit of concern about where all this was heading. It's not as if life ground to a halt here in Beirut, as we know, but there was concern. That concern now lifted?
In some respects, yes, from an immediate response to this military action. But just earlier in the week, we had an alleged Israeli airstrike on a base which killed Iranian personnel. So the issues, we've talked a lot about Russia and America, but there's another dynamic at play here, and that's Iran versus Israel. And that is dangerous, a very dangerous dynamic as well.
Iran, of course, on the ground in Syria, and Israel not happy about that. Martin, thank you very much indeed for joining us here in Beirut. Let's go straight over to Washington, D.C. now, where Barbara Plett-Usher is waiting for us. And Barbara, I just want to try and clarify what is being said over there at the moment. You had Donald Trump saying this was all part of a sustained effort to stop chemical weapons being used by Bashar al-Assad. Again, of course, the Syrians deny that they have been using them. And by implication, the implication that many picked up on was that that would mean the military strikes might go on. And then you had the Defence Secretary, James Mattis, saying, no, this was a one-time shot. What can we read into all of that?
Well, Matthew, there certainly was a difference in emphasis. As you said, President Trump talked about there being a sustained campaign until President Assad stopped using chemical weapons, although he didn't suggest it would be only military. He talked also about economic and diplomatic factors, but certainly he mentioned military. And then General Mattis saying, this is a one-time shot. We think we've sent a strong message. But actually, when he was asked about whether military operations would continue, he said, well, that depends on President Assad. He said, should he decide to use more chemical weapons in the future? So I think he left the door open there for further military strikes if there are more chemical weapons attacks. But there is a divide really between the White House and the Pentagon about how hard to go in. There had been indications that the White House and Mr. Trump did want a wider, more aggressive campaign. And General Mattis was clearly very concerned about escalation on the ground, especially with Russian forces there. He told a committee on the Capitol Hill this week that he didn't want to trigger an escalation that got out of control. And again, when he and General Dunford, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, were giving us a briefing yesterday, they emphasized that they had chosen the targets very carefully so that there would be no foreign casualties. So he was more cautious, and both he and the president did emphasize the limited nature of this operation, that it was just about targeting President Assad's chemical weapons facilities and capability, and not about anything wider, not about the civil war, not about regime change, as also, of course, did the allies Britain and France.
Barbara, you know this region well. You lived here for many years. You know Syria well. You'll have heard what Martin Patience was just saying about the reaction in Damascus today, which appears to be summed up by that image of President Assad walking into the presidential palace, clearly an image they wanted to show to the country and indeed to the world, of business as usual. Bearing in mind that image and bearing in mind the sort of, you can almost hear the sigh of relief here, or across the way from Syria. Bearing that in mind, does the White House, does Washington, D.C. believe it's achieved anything?
Well, again, from the briefing that we got yesterday, General Dunford acknowledged that they hadn't taken out all of President Assad's chemical weapons capabilities. He said there were other targets which they hadn't struck because of the calculation of the risk, because they were in areas where civilians might be killed or because they were in areas where other forces might be targeted. So they knew the limited nature of it, but they have stressed that it was wider than the attack they conducted last year, which was a sort of one attack against a Syrian airbase in a rural area. This was actually in urban areas. This was a number of attacks, double the number of missiles used, and so on. So they emphasized those things. But I think everyone here is aware that the calculation is very difficult. They want to do something strong enough to deter further chemical weapons use, and yet the area, the battlefield, is so complicated that they have to be very careful about using force, especially because they have made very clear they do not want to get involved in the civil war. As the Americans say, they don't want to put any skin into that game. They've been laser focused on their participation in Syria so far, laser focused on the fight against Islamic State group, and now trying to keep very focused just on this chemical weapons ability because of the larger international implications of violating the Chemical Weapons Convention, as they put it. But if General Mattis is serious about leaving the door open to further military strikes, that could also leave the door open to getting drawn in again, especially if President Assad calls his bluff. And I think that was probably the message that Mr. Assad was sending by walking around the area today.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. I mean, presumably, in many ways, the ball is in Damascus's court. Barbara Plett-Usher, thank you very much for joining us from Washington.